Thank you so much, Hannah. Okay, so today I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Siobhan Byrne, presenting the WPS agenda and the promise of feminist theory of power sharing. Siobhan Byrne is the inaugural director of the Institute for Intersectionality Studies and associate professor of political science and director of the Certificate in Peace and Post-Conflict Studies at the University of Alberta. Professor Byrne's areas of study include feminist anti-war activism, gender and power sharing, and peace building in societies transitioning from conflict, with a focus on Northern Ireland and Palestine, Israel. She's currently working on a SSHRC-funded book project with Alison McCullough titled Gender, Peace, and Power Sharing. The book develops a feminist theory of power sharing that brings together consociational approaches to conflict resolution and the UN-led Women, Peace, and Security agenda. She's also completing a manuscript exploring the relationship between identity politics and solidarity in local and transitional feminist peace movements in Israel, Palestine, and Northern Ireland. Professor Byrne's work is featured in the International Feminist Journal of Politics, International Political Science Review, and International Peacekeeping. Dr. Byrne earned her PhD in political science from Queen's University and held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University College Dublin in Ireland. Our speaker will present for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have 25 minutes for questions from our audience. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk. For those in Zoom, please raise your virtual hand or type your question into the chat. Anisha Sundi will be managing the online Q&A. We do ask that any audience questions, as always, be brief, be on topic, and be posed in the form of a question and a little cherry on top there to be related to our presenter's research. So thank you all so much for joining us today, both in the room and online. And please join me in welcoming Professor Byrne.
Sure, I'm hooked up here correctly. You can hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Hannah and Alex and Laura and everybody, the whole WAP team, for inviting me to speak here today. Thank you also for the land acknowledgement, which is a reminder for me of the deep connection between identity and land. As a settler and a visitor, it's my responsibility to recognize that settler colonialism works to break that connection, and that decolonization as a project is unfinished. So I'd like to share a little bit of the roadmap for today. I'm going to begin with some introductory remarks. Then I'll introduce power sharing and the UN-led Women, Peace, and Security agenda. I'm going to reflect on how both power sharing and WPS become implicated, or the precursor to WPS in the 1990s, what Mary Calder calls the New Wars era, the era of the peace process, through to the post 9/11 wars and what we might call the diminishing returns of both power sharing and WPS. I'm going to share some feminist articulations of power and sharing, reflect on the current context of what WPS and power sharing mean today in the context of new wars, and the prospects for feminist power sharing. So in terms of introductory remarks, I was pleased to receive the invitation to speak, not least because the trip gave me the opportunity to visit a set of 1930s era social realist murals that were painted by my spouse's grandfather, Louis Rubinstein. This morning, I walked over to Adolphus Busch Hall, what was formerly the Harvard Germanic Museum, to view the stunning and unsettling frescoes filled with images of giant muscular Norse gods and other creatures on a crimson battlefield and what look like dark industrial labor sites. The characters are fashioned in Nazi-style attire, with some wearing gas masks and holding canisters spewing green plumes. Somebody was practicing the organ while I was viewing the art as well, which added to the ambiance. They're huge murals in the entranceway when you enter the museum. The art is unmistakably subversive, it's anti-Nazi and anti-war. The original unveiling of the frescoes in the mid-1930s was controversial among the Boston press, art critics, and students, a time when being anti-fascist or anti-Nazi was radical. During the Cold War, the frescoes were actually covered over with fiberboard panels to avoid further controversy, only to be unveiled again decades later. It strikes me as fitting to visit these murals today when delivering a talk on the theme of peace, a time of tremendous conflict when challenging war can seem radical, disloyal even in some contexts, and divisive, to go against the experts and to endure the wrath of the popular press and the prevailing political opinion. I am buoyed, however, by the reminder that we tend to reach for historical images and narratives of resistance, critiques of racist imperial wars and genocide along messages of peace when we construct the stories of our ethical lives to describe our just societies and imagine our humanity. I feel heartened personally because without such historical records of resistance, I would surely be filled with dread. But I have to admit that I also feel warned. Today, I've been invited to speak with you about feminist interrogations of peace negotiations and power sharing models of conflict resolution at a time when calling for peace negotiations in Ukraine, Palestine, Israel, and beyond seems not only out of reach, but also subversive and radical. Recently, I wrote a short piece on the Israeli-Palestinian-based group Women Wage Peace, which organizes joint actions with the Palestinian peace group Women of the Sun. Together, the two groups had coordinated a thousands-strong march in Jerusalem and the Dead Sea on October 4th, which was an improbable message of solidarity in the midst of protracted conflict and ongoing military occupation. It was just 3 days later, in the wake of the Hamas attacks, that Women Wage Peace posted an image of a bloody dove on their social media feed. It took another week before the movement issued a full statement on the rapid escalation of violence in Gaza. Every woman, Jewish and Arab, gives birth to her children to see them grow and flourish and not to bury them. That's why even today, amid the pain and the feeling that the belief in peace has collapsed, we extend a hand in peace to the mothers of Gaza and the West Bank. This was undoubtedly a painful statement to write through grief. Veteran Canadian peace activist Vivian Silver, a founding member of Women Wage Peace, is among those Israelis who are missing since the Hamas attacks. It's tremendously difficult and again radical to promote peace and dialogue in times of war. And this is at no time truer than today. I preface my comments in this way to share how difficult anti-war messages are to make, which can require subversive design or careful introspection and solidarity. They're also difficult to see and hear when they're deliberately misread or boarded up. And they're difficult to forge, especially across the kinds of communal lines that we're told are the heart of intractable communal violence. It's in thinking about peace that brought me to this research project with my collaborator, Alison McCullough, who's an expert in power sharing systems and design. We're writing a book about how to bring together power sharing theory, which is a model of shared democratic governance for deeply divided societies, and the women, peace, and security agenda with an insistence on the representation of women. What brought Alison and I together was the 10-year anniversary of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. We were both attending the International Studies Association annual meeting in Montreal that year. There was a flurry of 1325 panels up at the top of the hotel. You know, those strange conference rooms that are in bedrooms, and you're sitting in those boudoir type chairs. And the rooms were packed. There was a lot of momentum and enthusiasm around the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. And Alison rode the elevators up with me to attend those panels. I rode the elevators down to the grand ballrooms with Alison to attend panels on ethnic conflict and power sharing and so forth. And it felt for us that we were bringing together women, peace, and security and power sharing in our trip through the elevator. You had scholars who were studying the same conflicts, the same peace processes, but that were not speaking to each other. So we felt we were doing some of that work in the elevator. So one of the nice things about presenting in a themed thematic speaker series is I don't need to provide you with a fulsome account of what 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security agenda is. I'll just say a few things. The first is that WPS is a common shorthand. It expresses a commitment to include women and a gender perspective in conflict mediation, conflict resolution, and post-conflict peace building. The term WPS comes to us from the NGO working group, which had brought together a group of civil society actors that had pushed for a United Nations Security Council resolution. That resolution is 1325, which was passed in 2000, which mandates the inclusion of women in all aspects of conflict resolution. And it's just the first resolution in 2000. It's been translated into over 100 languages. I remember being in Haifa in maybe 2004, 2005, where activists were busy translating 1325 into Hebrew and Arabic because they thought it could be a useful mechanism for advocating for change from political leaders. So it begins with 1325, but there are a basket of UN Security Council resolutions. In some ways, we might think about WPS as these resolutions, but it's something more than that. The WPS agenda is also realized through national action plans. Canada is supposed to be releasing its third. So we've been waiting all year for that. Feminist foreign policies. Canada has a feminist foreign policy. Germany has just adopted a feminist foreign policy earlier this year. We might think about the Women, Peace and Security, what Women, Peace and Security is as part of new class of gender experts and gender focal points. We find them in UN field missions. Entailing the work of the UN standby mediation team or regional women's mediation networks, the work of NGOs and think tanks who are active on women, peace, and security. So WPS refers to, 1325, the other Security Council resolutions, but it means so much more. So that's WPS. What is power sharing? Power sharing is really an umbrella term for a variety of governance designs that facilitate what Arnold Leiphart calls a spirit of accommodation between divided communities. Now, there are many different ways to share power, but given the centrality of consociationalism, which is a terrible word, the other one is centripetalism, in power sharing theory and practice, this is generally the type of power sharing that I'm referring to, consociationalism, which begins with the work of Arnold Leiphart in the 1960s as an attempt to explain democratic stability in his home country of the Netherlands and extended to explain democratic stability in plural societies like Belgium, Austria, and Switzerland in the 1970s. In essence, power sharing refers to a set of interlocking institutions for ethnic co-governance between majorities and minorities in divided societies. The most common distinguishing feature of power sharing are arrangements whether a power sharing institution predetermines which groups will share power, which is a liberal form of power sharing, or a more corporate form where the communities are already decided before power sharing takes place. In both variants, though, the underlying logic of consociationalism is that ethnic minorities ought to be able to directly represent themselves in all aspects of political power. Institutionally, power sharing can look like executive power sharing, what's called grand coalitions. Power sharing can look like group proportionality in other institutions, the legislature, the security forces. It can mean mutual veto. It can mean autonomy arrangements for all major ethnic groups. Now, some of the reasons why actors might pursue power sharing in conflict: reasons of political expediency. Brendan O'Leary calls power sharing a form of necessary triage. It's what you need in order to end a conflict, stem the violence before peace is possible. It can also provide reassurance to all signatories and reduce the prospect that spoilers will interrupt the power sharing process. So there are the reasons of political expediency why power sharing might be chosen, but also it's based on normative principles. It's not just a set of designs about what can work, it's also a theory about what should work. Power sharing is rooted in principles of broad inclusion and elite cooperation. It supports consensual decision-making over adversarial politics. A central purpose of power sharing is to broaden access to government for ethnic, linguistic, religious, and other ascriptive minorities who, under simple majoritarian decision-making rules, would be denied such access, whether through violence or repression or such. Theoretically, power sharing and feminist approaches to conflict resolution are typically framed as oppositional. So in the power sharing scholarship, women and gender and other categories beyond ethno-national ones are seen as not central. Adrian Galkey, for example, argues that a society deeply divided on the basis of gender is, practically speaking, inconceivable. John McGarry and Brendan O'Leary, power sharing experts, lament the fact that gender and class have not been at the forefront of politics in deeply divided societies. And they write, "We do not think this is highly desirable, but it's the fact." So there's a way in which the power sharing literature has ignored gender and feminist work. As well, though, in the feminist critical scholarship, power sharing theory is sometimes cast as incapable of recognizing gender and intersectional categories. So Ronan Kennedy, Claire Pearson, and Jennifer Thompson find a conceptual misalignment between gendered understandings of conflict and the consociational model as a means to create a stable peace. In her case study of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Maria Adriana Diana sees an uneasy relationship between gender and consociationalism. She writes, "By entrenching ethno-nationalism as the dominant political discourse, consociational forms work to sideline gender dynamics of conflict and conflict transformation." It's been these kinds of framing, oppositional consociationalism and gendered approaches to conflict, that I think Allison and I were mediating as we traveled up and down the elevator at the ISA all those years ago. Our work is part of a project that takes seriously the feminist critiques of power sharing, but also considers the possibility of bringing power sharing into alignment with feminist approaches to conflict resolution. One of the reasons we want to do so is because of the way in which power sharing and women, peace, and security become important for resolving conflict. We have two approaches that seem to work at cross purposes: power sharing, which relies on the participation of ethno-national elites, most often men, and the women, peace, and security agenda, which advocates for a gender perspective and women's inclusion in peace processes and post-conflict institutions. The 1990s really kick off what we might call that new wars period, or the era of the peace process. Leiphardt began to advocate for consociationalism as a policy recommendation across all divided societies. Timothy Sisk notes that the first decade following the end of the Cold War, as much as half of the armed conflicts that ended were silenced as a result of a negotiated agreement, which was a threefold increase over the previous era. In this period, the UN Secretary General writes in an agenda for peace in 1992, "We have been given a second chance to create the world of our charter." There is a sense in which here the concept of post-conflict peace building is introduced as a means for institution building and designed to complement preventative diplomacy, peacemaking, and peacekeeping. The UN now sees itself as unshackled by the formerly divided and immobile Security Council. Perhaps this is where we are again today. UN-assisted mediation efforts and the deployment of UN envoys and advisors expanded to conflict zones through this period, establishing the UN's role as a conflict mediation and peacekeeping clearinghouse. Christine Bell outlines several reasons why there is also a rise of a peace agreement after the end of the Cold War. reasons such as an increase in interstate conflict, this move from a norm of non-interference to regional engagement and indeed direct negotiations, settlements increasingly reached through ceasefires tied to new political agreements, and settlements also formally drafted and involving local and international actors. The rise of the peace agreement happens alongside increasing international attention to gender and peace. The 1995 Beijing Platform for Action introduces us with gender mainstreaming. It's also in the 1990s that we have the International Criminal Tribunals for rape in war and conflict. This focus on gendered experiences in conflict is part of this move to mainstream gender in international practice. And the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition stands out as one of the models in which women are included in peace processes in the 1990s, and in the case of Northern Ireland, in power sharing system in particular. So I'll just say a few things briefly about Northern Ireland. It had a unique electoral formula to the peace talks in 1996, and a set of feminist activists got together. They formed a political party, and through a unique electoral formula, managed to get elected to the peace talks, including Monica McWilliams, who's a leading figure in the movement. McWilliams adopted the term accidental activism, which I quite like, to describe the way in which Northern Ireland women initially and accidentally became political agents through early experiences in grassroots organizing. At the peace table, members of this all-women political party demanded the creation of a civic forum to represent civil society. They demanded the naming of women specifically in the Good Friday Agreement beyond the two communities, the creation of an equality commission for Northern Ireland, the demand to create a Bill of Rights, statutory duties to address inequalities beyond the two communities, including race, sexual orientation, age, and more. The goal was for a more inclusive peace, as well as legislation that would reflect a commitment to human rights and equality. The story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, from its origins in accidental activism to the party's rather accidental inclusion in the peace talks, offers a complicated reading of the peace process. On the one hand, it offers important insights, both in how robust equality measures and innovative inclusion mechanisms can help to inform the Good Friday Agreement, which was adopted in 1998, but it also exposes the precarity of inclusion. The inclusion of women in the forum was not by any feature of power sharing in particular that required the representation of women. Instead, it was this quirk of the electoral formula. So the story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition also tells us that the push for the kind of equality and inclusion measures can also complement power sharing processes in an important way, but such inclusion must also be actively fought for and won creatively in this instance. Coming into the next decade, power sharing is the model of choice for resolving conflict. And 1325 is passed in 2000. It reflects those experiences of the Northern Ireland women, the Beijing Platform for Action, and a longer history of feminist activism for peace as well. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and power sharing come together in the UN in some really unique ways. This is just one example of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, which has a team of mediation experts. The first mediation team was created in 2008, and it included a power sharing expert. So these experts would be deployed to a conflict zone on very short notice to help resolve or provide assistance in constitution writing, process, that sort of thing. 2 years after the mediation team was created, a gender advisor was added to the mediation team as well. in an interview with a member of the Gender, Peace, and Security Unit at the UN, I had asked about like how power sharing experts and gender experts get deployed to conflict zones. She said to me, you know, truly, initially, it was a little tough going because there were very few requests for the gender advisor. Very few people called up and said, it's an emergency, we need the gender advisor. And she said, you know, despite the initial challenges, they were able to combine gender expertise along with other expertise on the mediation team. She said to me, we got a little smarter and said, okay, we'll try to do joint deployment so that when somebody asks for, you know, a process design expert, we'll send the gender expert along because they go hand in hand. They might not see how it goes hand in hand, but they'll find out. In addition, all standby mediation advisors have in recent years been required to demonstrate expertise in the effective integration of gender and WPS concerns in their field of specialization. (1325) is passed in 2000, and in some ways, the story of 1325 maps along with those post 9/11 wars. So Afghanistan happens 1 year after the passage of 1325, the US invasion of Afghanistan. And the questions were, you know, would power sharing as a go-to model of choice for resolving conflict even be applicable in the case of Afghanistan? How would the women, peace, and security agenda as well be implicated? There are some excellent feminist analyses of the ways in which women figure in to the justification for the invasion and for an ongoing occupation of Afghanistan. You know, for example, the radio addresses of the First Lady and other political figures describing why it is that an invasion is necessary, not just you know, to root out the terrorist threat, but also to save Afghan women. So we see the kinds of language around women, peace, and security being used in an effort to help think about and justify really some of these post 9/11 wars. Sherry Blair as well, who said at the time, the women of Afghanistan still have a spirit that belies their unfair, downtrodden image. We need to help them free that spirit and give them their voice back. 9/11, as the post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan also carried with it a purpose of nation building pretty shortly after the first initial invasion. So George Bush remembers in his memoirs, after 9/11, Afghanistan was the ultimate nation building mission. And it was part of that nation building mission that we see ideas around power sharing being floated. So for example, to bring together rival anti-Taliban factions in the Bonn agreement process in December of 2001. These interim agreements were intended as a first step towards the establishment of a broad-based, gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, and fully represented government. So says the agreement. And later, of course, there were, which had seemed impossible at the time, but towards the end of the US mission in Afghanistan, discussions of what power sharing might look like with the Taliban as well. Now, there is a little bit of rewriting of history. President Biden says Afghanistan was actually never about nation building at all. But those really were some of the initial thinking at the beginning of the war. In this way, we can see how power sharing and women, peace, and security get implicated, but perhaps not in the ways that feminist scholars had imagined. At the drawdown of the US mission in Afghanistan, Fionnuala Ní Aoláin, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, remarked, "We've had 20 years plus of the women, peace, and security agenda. And if that agenda doesn't mean something now, it's worthless." And that way, when we track WPS with Afghanistan, and we reflect on the drawdown of the US mission, the return of the Taliban to government, what difference did WPS make? What impact did some of that thinking on inclusion and power sharing make as well? Given the justifications for the US-led invasion of Afghanistan, nowhere should Resolution 1325 be more present. And yet the norm failed to inform power sharing and mediation at every turn. For power sharing and women, peace, and security to have relevance in this new and different, again, decade of military intervention and war, we have to pay careful attention to the diminishing returns of both norms across these new wars and the post-9/11 period. There have been attempts by feminist scholars, but also practitioners, to reimagine what power sharing is, to make it relevant and to take on board some of the feminist critiques. So Maria Hadjipavlou and Olga Dimitriou, for example, prefer the term sharing of power instead of power sharing, to put sharing front and center. And both Maria and Olga have worked on thinking about power sharing for Cyprus in particular. Sanam Anderlini prefers the term responsibility sharing instead of power sharing. The kinds of responsibility that might highlight a kind of sharing ethos or joint administration by communities. A feminist reformulation of power sharing might imagine that it's a relational practice that aims to build caring communities between people differently situated. When focusing on a conception of sharing, that might mean something like dialogue. Power sharing theory starts to look a little bit like feminist transversal theories of dialogue. So transversalism is a theory coined by Neera Yuval Davis to describe the way in which women who are differently positioned in terms of their ethnic identity and communities remain rooted in those communities, but shift in order to understand each other. The term transversalism is an attempt to capture a dialogic model of understanding and community building. Transversal theory and practices have informed feminist activism in places like Northern Ireland, as well as Bosnia, and indeed as in Cyprus as well. A focus on sharing through dialogue in power sharing could find common cause with transversal theory. In this way, feminist reformulation of power sharing might emphasize the dialogic aspects of power sharing. So the current context, last month, the UN begins its open session on 1325. And 1325, there's still optimism about what 1325 and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda means. So for example, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield at the UN Security Council remarks, the US stands ready to support all member states in adopting, implementing, adapting, and revising national action plans and strategies on WPS. By doing so, we help women and girls, especially in conflict areas, achieve stability and economic prosperity and future growth. There is, of course, also serious concerns about the limits of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and the extent to which it has made differences in some of the conflicts like Afghanistan, and a reevaluation of what Women, Peace, and Security might mean for new forms of conflict resolution going forward. What does this mean in thinking about the prospects for what a feminist theory of power sharing might look like? According to the UN, women have been historically excluded from peace talks. In 2022 and 2018, women represent just 3% of mediators, 4% of signatories, 13% of negotiators. This includes, but it's not restricted to, those talks that culminate in power sharing agreements. So what then might a feminist theory of power sharing offer? So to be sure, power sharing is only one aspect of a comprehensive and inclusive conflict resolution strategy, but how states allocate decision-making power, how marginalized groups, including women, gain access to that power is central to the pursuit of sustainable peace, democracy, and justice in divided societies. Power sharing offers an opportunity to build in gender quotas, to write women and other marginalized actors into peace agreements based on the principles of inclusion and representation. And this can happen creatively, like with the election of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, to seize an opportunity to be involved in a power sharing talks leading to a power sharing agreement, or such as the deployment of a gender expert along with a power sharing expert or a process design expert, as happens with the UN standby team. But it can be also theorized directly too. Power sharing scholarship can theorize inclusion beyond ethno-nationalism, not just viewing WPS and power sharing is diametrically opposed, to reimagine what power looks like, power sharing looks like, and who gets to share in that power. Tracing the contours of a feminist theory of power sharing, certainly it should be curious about power, paying attention to the development and application of power sharing in women, peace, and security over time, whose interests are served when women, peace, and security is invoked, when power sharing is an option that's selected for negotiating an end to an agreement. It's to trouble what it means to share power, who gets to share that power. Surely sharing power means something more than dividing out, splitting power. Perhaps a more robust conception, to prioritize inclusivity, which means paying attention to political activities outside of institutional politics and beyond formal elites, as well as consultative and representative in terms of governance bodies as well. And a robust conception of political stability, understanding political stability as more than just the absence of war, but something that is truer to a conception of what democratic inclusion looks like. It's not clear what impact power sharing logics of ceasefires, negotiations among all parties, joint constitution writing, and shared power will have on the 2020 wars in Ukraine, between Israelis and Palestinians, perhaps amongst Palestinian political leadership as well, in Syria and beyond. It's not clear what impact women, peace, and security will have as we approach the 25th anniversary in 2025. On the 1990 settlements, Northern Ireland stands out as the archetypal example of power sharing, but power sharing in Northern Ireland remains suspended. In fact, the power sharing institutions have been suspended more than 40% of the time since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Many of the advances in human rights actually in Northern Ireland came during periods of suspension of the power sharing systems. So gender, marriage equality, for example, access to abortion, those sorts of things. Of the post-9/11 attempts at settlement, power sharing proposals didn't deliver in Afghanistan, and clearly women, peace, and security has not made a lasting impact. And indeed, we may have left conditions more dangerous for women who are champions of human rights in Afghanistan in those 20 years. The UN-sponsored Syria talks are stalled. Poor integration of the Women's Advisory Board. There isn't really a seat at the table for women in Syria. It can feel like a tremendously difficult and radical time to promote peace and dialogue today. A feminist theory of power sharing, I would submit, can be both how-to, so how to do power sharing better, but it can also be a critical perspective on what power sharing is, how power sharing fits into the universe of war, intervention, mediation, and peace. It can be aspirational, and transformative, motivated by thinking about peace through justice and not just to focus on stability. A feminist theory of power sharing is one that would insist on ceasefires, on dialogue, on negotiating a peace. That negotiating a peace, in fact, is a feminist peace. The alternative, which is war, defeat, majoritarianism, is not a feminist future. It's no future at all. I'm going to leave my comments there. Thank you very much.